attack and privacy threat that no one's thinking about. And that's attacks on what we call level 0, the peer-to-peer broadcast traffic. So whenever you do a transaction, you of course broadcast that transaction to other peers in the network. And this is very easy to both attack via Sybil attacks because that traffic is unencrypted, unauthenticated. I think that holds for all major cryptocurrencies. But even worse, we do know after the Snowden revelations that well-funded government agencies such as the NSA, but now even probably well-funded companies can simply record all of that traffic and use the metadata and the timing of that traffic to de-anonymize and essentially either capture or reveal the identity of who's done every single transaction on any blockchain. So we've been working with Binance Lab at the NIM project to build a next generation mixed network with anonymous authentication credentials, which we think can solve that problem, but I'll be discussing that tomorrow. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Harry. So Jeremy, sharing on from Harry's experience, any experience on security or privacy breaches and how you protect yourself from that, from a personal experience or from OmiseGO?
Yeah, so from a personal experience, I guess it just happened a couple of days ago. I thought I'd have a look at have I been owned, and I noticed that one of my older email addresses is listed 16 times from different breaches. So luckily I've been using a password manager for some time, so I haven't noticed is an operating word, anything going wrong with my accounts. But that's happened really recently. Maybe to make it a little bit more blockchain focused. Something that has happened, and I think just generally in the industry we need to think about, is people losing funds. Just so it's not really, say, an active attack. It's just how do we protect people from themselves? So an example of this, I was pretty excited with Ethereum some time ago. I bought 10 ETH, which wasn't very much at the time, and I created a Geth wallet on a VPS, and that disappeared. And I came back sort of a year later and went, oh, okay, that's a shame. But I think that's something that maybe many people, like my father, for example, has experienced, and that's something that is important to progress industry.
So to all the panelists here, so what do you think are the changes required? Is it more from the regulatory point of view, or more from the self-regulation point of view, or are we shifting more the responsibility towards individuals? So Toby, would you like to take on that first?
Yeah, regulation. The thing about regulation is it always lags behind innovation, and that's exactly the way it should be. If it ever catches up, then it acts as the sort of the glue in the wheels of progress. And one of the problems with regulation is that it's very, very easy to get too carried away with it, particularly in an area right now where we're still innovating across all areas of it. And you do run the risk of shutting down some of the really amazing things that are taking place in this space. And actually, again, if you increase the amount of regulation, all you really do, rather than potentially solving the problem, is shift all the work from one area to somewhere with less regulation, which is not really the desired outcome. One thing that we know, for example, the European Commission taking this very seriously, and looking and listening a lot, which is very, very helpful, and listening to what they should do in order to help, and talking to all the people who are actually innovating, because they're very anxious to avoid regulating the innovation out of the system. So regulation's a tough one. Of course, what you can't do is regulate user safety, and you said protecting users against themselves. One of my colleagues who's a cryptographer says that he blames cryptographers. I'm not quite sure I blame all cryptographers, but for making something that's spectacularly human unfriendly. And when it comes to talking about wallets and things like that, we use all these words and terms which we think mean something, but the reality is to normal people, they just don't. And we rely on the fact that if you lose the key to your house, you haven't just written your house off. You don't have to burn it to the ground and start again. You can go to a locksmith and you can get another key. And this is one of the reasons why people leave their crypto assets in exchanges, because exchanges act as a locksmith. If they lose the private key, well, they didn't have it in the first place, so it's not an issue. They can get it back. Whereas with greater privacy and greater control comes enormous responsibility. And we're expecting people to look after these private keys, and if they lose them, you end up with these comical situations like this poor guy in the UK who had goodness knows how many bitcoins he mined in the early days, and then he threw the hard drive out. And then when Bitcoin price went up, he was rather sadly pictured on the news and in newspapers digging through a tip trying to find his hard drive, which he never found. And that's one of the risks of these. We need to think about how to solve those kind of problems. And people are rubbish at this kind of stuff, even with their own pictures and photos. I mean, how many people in this room have a proper solid backup of all the pictures and all the things that they hold dear to them on their phone? And if people can't even back up a few pictures, how can we expect them to keep a private key? And that's why we need to look at other areas where we can help people with that kind of thing in order to prevent the massive loss of those assets. And that's both a technological issue and all sorts of other ways in which we can look at it.
Can I make a quick comment, which is that I worked for about a decade with the World Wide Web Consortium, Tim Berners-Lee, who gave us the web, which is currently being centralized, and the Internet Engineering Task Force, which gave us such things as TCP/IP and TLS as the sort of backbone of the internet. And all of these innovations, the original internet, the original web, were not ran by regulators. They were self-regulated by open, multi-stakeholder standards bodies. If it worked for the original web and internet, I believe it will probably work out for cryptocurrency. In general, I think we should be very suspicious of regulation, particularly premature optimization via regulation, because the entire point of cryptocurrencies is to bring human freedom, financial freedom, to people, and in general, regulation does, by its very nature, restrict freedom.
So Harry, for your current project name and your previous projects, I believe it's Nick Sleep and Panoramics. Is this something that you were having to contend with relating to regulations?
We generally are trying to build software which is compliant with regulations such as the General Data Protection Regulation. But as we all know, these kinds of European privacy regulations mostly just have you fill out stupid forms and click on emails, and they more or less waste your time, and they do very little for privacy. So we're trying to convince the European Commission and other parts of other countries that rather than waste their time building ridiculous privacy regulation that doesn't really work and can't actually help users, to actually use decentralized and privacy-enhancing technologies, such as mixed networks, or, for example, next-generation protocols, such as the IETF message layer security protocol.
Thanks. So Jeremy,
I just want to say that let's don't speak about regulation now. We should better concentrate on education, because still so many people, they are using the same passwords everywhere. They don't have any measures how to, they don't know, they don't have someone to block him from using this password, and they're just very lazy. So I think regulation is second, the first is education.
So Dmitry, you're also the CEO and co-founder of cybersecurity consulting company called Hacken, which is crowdsourced security platform for white hat hackers, Hacken Proof, and crypto exchanges analytical platform CER, cryptoexchangeranks.com, and you're an expert in cybersecurity and digital assets audit, and is also a member of ACCA and ex-Deloitte top manager. So it would be also a good thing to actually check with you on what are some of the best practices moving on from that you have observed in the industry. For example, what are some of the measures to prevent hacks as an end user on the exchanges? Yeah.
So first I want to ask, there is two layers. There is a layer of a person, how to be protected, and second is, so for example, exchange, how to protect users from. So first of all, I want to ask the question to raise the hands. Who has ever been hacked? Do we have such people?
What was the question?
Have you ever been hacked?
Has anyone been hacked?
Well, most people have been hacked without knowing it.
Okay. So I mean, like, if you didn't raise your hand, probably you're not so important, because everybody can be hacked. I'm sorry to say that. It's all about the matter of costs and what you can get from it, because we are living in digital world when we have a traffic layer, when we have personal layer when we can phish. Hackers can go and phish your wife, for example, when she's and go into your network. So it's like a lot of things that you can do. But of course, the key is to educate yourself all the time and to use all available tools. You will never be protected 100%, but you can reach a pretty good percentage, like 99%. So for a personal security, I would say never use the same password. I know it's very difficult. We are all very lazy people, but yes, just try to use your cybersecurity Hacken, like write it down. For example, I'm writing down my passwords. I use password managers that I trust, and this is how I work. Second thing is that always use two-factor, but never link your two-factor and to your mobile phone. No, because there is a very big risk for SIM swap or just a simple steal of your phone. Yeah, if I steal your phone, I can immediately take out the SIM card and knowing your emails, I will just reset all the passwords. So be careful with this as well. And the third thing is, and then I would like to speak about exchanges. So we recently made a research, and we identified that out of 100 top crypto exchanges, only 16% has their bug bounty program. So it means that if the hacker or like any other user identifies a bug, he can submit it and to receive reward. What does it mean? It means that the rest, 83%, they don't announce bug bounty because they know they have a lot of problems and they don't want to get people's attention. So yes, we are in the industry that is very immature, and the level of cybersecurity of most of the exchanges is pretty bad. So what I propose to everyone is that you have to select exchanges who has bug bounty. Why? Because hackers are also lazy. They are lazy people like us. Sometimes even more lazy. And if they see that the exchange is taking care of the security by opening the bug bounty, they understand that probably white hats already went there and checked for all the bugs in order to get more money, or to get the money. So they will probably go to some other exchanges, because really, like, most of the exchanges are founded not by technical guys, but by finance guys, or PR guys, and marketing guys, and they really care more about speed and marketing rather than security. So just pay attention to bug bounty.
So based on experience, based on the hacks that you've seen so far, what percentage of it would you attribute it to insider threats, insider hacks?
Inside hacks? Oh, this is interesting, unexpected question. But I would say that if to look at the picture of cryptocurrency hacks, I would say that more than half is inside. It's rather you are trying to intentionally say, "Oh my God, I was hacked," but you just like spend the money of traders. Or yes, it was some insider like conflict in the company. So I would say it's more than half.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I agree with your advice. The problem is with giving people security advice is they don't take it. We can sit here from now until the end of time, and possibly even longer, telling people to use secure passwords, to use two-factor authentication and to do it properly, and they still won't. And one of the issues with that is passwords just generates a security mechanism, just don't work. And as people involved in technology, we need to find better ways of doing it, where it's not so much effort for people. And I guess that would be one of my worries about continued advice, because it's never worked. We've been talking about passwords now for, 20 years, and telling people to secure them and not use the same one.
Yeah, passwords were invented as a temporary hack. I think the Multic system in the 1960s or 70s at MIT, they were never meant to be a long-term way to deal with security and user accounts. So we also have 30 years of research into cryptographic credentials for users and what's called capabilities-based systems. While there's been tons of people making stupid coins and weird ICOs and tokens, I think it probably would be very worthwhile for the blockchain community to investigate the proper usage of credentials. So we're looking at anonymous authentication credentials at NIM. I would hope that other people, we have tons of research there that has not been applied to space, and I hope entrepreneurs go out and look at that research and start applying it to the space.
So Jeremy, you're also the product lead at OmiseGO, and you're responsible for product strategy and coordination of product delivery. Can you share a bit about any best practices as well that you have seen your organization implement?
Yeah, sure, of course. I think it starts with the knowledge that hiding the information isn't really the best way forward. So being open about the processes allows people to be able to audit internally and also be able to understand. Just because you understand how a process works doesn't necessarily mean that you can actually go about it and exploit that process. The other thing that we'll be looking to implement when we do go live is to implement bug bounties, to engage the community where there's a wider range of eyes that can look at our product and actually search for problems itself, because as large as our organization would be, it's not as large as the crowd would be. Yeah.
So the last question for the panel, starting with Toby, which is, for Toby himself, he's also the producer of successful artificial life creatures series of games and early developer at DeepMind. And based on your 30 experience in software development and 10 years as CTO across 3 companies, I think we'll be very excited to hear about what you think is the key takeaway in terms of how can technology be used to create a safer environment for all stakeholders.
Well, I mean, technology's got a lot to tackle on all the fronts, because technology enables things long before it actually helps, and that enablement means that we all rush off and invent cool things before we've actually thought about it for long enough to figure out how to make it friendly to people. And actually, this touched on something that you were saying earlier, actually, about how we make these things scale and security and software complexity, I would say, is one of the issues that affects us enormously. As human beings, we have a habit of wanting to be in full control of the software that we're writing, which tends to mean that we approach these things from the top down and write more software rather than less software. And one of the reasons why Bitcoin was neat and tidy was because it was short, sweet, and simple. And since then, we layer more and more complexity on all of these things, and the more plumbing you've got, the easier it is to block up the pipes. So one of the things that I would say is very, very important is looking at how we manage that software complexity in a way that allows a lot of these problems to largely solve themselves.
Harry?
Yeah, so just to go back to the key and the password issue. So this is the issue of authentication. So an authentication is some sort of proof that you are who you are, that you own these assets, or you have these attributes, citizenship, age, whatever. And obviously the passwords and cryptographic keys are not that different because you can lose them. They're just different sizes, really. You can consider passwords to be a very short symmetric key between a client and a server. And what we have in reality, when we actually try to identify ourselves, is we have basically a deeply complex social environment. And what you see with a lot of very simplistic identity schemes, thinking about DIDs actually on the top of my head, but simply throwing an identifier on a blockchain or some key material on blockchain probably is not a really good solution. What we need is solutions which embed themselves in our social environment, but which also don't create surveillance nightmares, create privacy nightmares that do ridiculous things, such as use biometrics, which can then be faked or leaked. It's a really horrible idea, for example, the biometrics on a blockchain where they're publicly accessible, et cetera, et cetera. People tend not to think about these things when they're inventing weird companies and new research projects. But I do think that there has been lots of research on the intersection of privacy and authentication, particularly looking at anonymous credentials, particularly looking at multi-show credentials, and embedding those within complex social incentives and social networks, and that's probably where I think the future of a lot of these safety issues can be resolved.
Interesting. I mean, the point of social networks. Jeremy, any key takeaway in terms of how technology can be used to enable a safer use of tech for the users, for digital assets?
Yeah, sure. I think one thing that we can think about is by using the power of the consensus mechanisms to sort of decide upon whether users' funds, how users' funds could be actually secured. So we have this kind of concept when we're talking about the Binance DEX or the DEX that OmiseGO is building, so user funds being held in custody essentially by the consensus of the chain. But we've only been looking at it in really general forms. It's like, okay, well, an exchange, for example, is only allowed to perform certain actions. So maybe they can accept orders, they can settle orders. But that can be taken further. So maybe there's a grey line here that we need to, a grey area that we go into. But there's ability here to say, well, okay, something's gone wrong. Do we need to block this? And this is sort of something that is available to all the participants in that consensus. So it brings up larger questions around what is the social consensus around this, and we've seen this in Ethereum in the past, and I think these are questions that we'll think about more in the future. And I don't have any answers for that, but we do have a lot of these enabling technologies that have these social, human impacts that we can save, but we also have we have these problems as well that we never had before that we need to think about how to actually resolve.
So what about Dmitry? I mean, in the work that you do, what are some of the challenges that you think we will be facing in terms of this industry, in terms of protecting the privacy and security of digital asset users moving forward?
First of all, I think that we, if to talk about exchanges are still kind of black box. No one knows what is happening there. I think we're gonna move for wider transparency. We will see more and more of what is inside exchanges, how they keep their digital assets, what is the custodian mechanism, and these things gonna improve. What's very important is such initiatives as was during Binance Week, the hackathon. I don't know, we're gonna have the winners very soon. They will be awarded, but making such hackathons will definitely improve the ecosystem. And another thing, I want people to be fair with themselves. And if you're not sure that you are capable to manage your passwords properly, like having a lot of different passwords and proper set two-factor, then you have to ask the professional to help you. And another point is that big exchanges that do care about security and transparency, that are creating initiatives on the, for example, the SAFU, they can help you with this. So ask your support of your exchange and ask to help to set up the things right, and this can protect your funds. Yeah.
Okay, so we come to the end of our panel. I think if I can summarize, I think for this topic itself, it's more like an aggregation amongst industry, enterprise, as well as individuals, and looking at how we actually congregate, the requirements relating to business processes as well as user requirements in terms of security and privacy. So thank you very much to the panelists for today's sharing. Thank you.